My name is Thea O'Neill, and I'm 33 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my dad introduced me to 14 relatives with a single word, the waitress, and waited for the laugh and got it. I stood there in the apron I'd tied on to serve a meal I had cooked myself, and I smiled the way you smile when you've heard a joke so many times it stops being a joke and starts being a job description. But the thing my dad didn't know, the thing none of them knew, was what I'd already decided to do the next time my mom raised her glass to my sister. And I watched her reach for it. Welcome back to red wine revenge, where the quietest person at the table is usually the one holding it up until she stops. If a family that measures love like a scoreboard is a story you know in your bones, stay with me tonight. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Every family has a ritual, and ours had a shape you could set a watch by. My parents' dining room seats 8 comfortably and 14 if you drag in the folding table from the garage and pretend the seam in the middle isn't there. I was the one who dragged it in. I was the one who ironed the good cloth, brined the turkey 2 days early, and drove over at 7 that morning while the rest of them were still asleep in their own houses. By the time the first cars pulled into the driveway, the smell coming out of that kitchen was mine, though nobody would ever say so. I tied the apron on out of habit, the way a nurse clips a pen to her scrubs. And then I did what I always did. I carried. I refilled. I cleared. My cousins settled into their chairs like guests at a restaurant because to them in that room, that is more or less what I was. My father sat at the head of the table with his hand around a beer and the particular ease of a man who has never once wondered who set the plate in front of him. My mother floated between conversations, touching shoulders, laughing her hostess laugh. Nobody was cruel yet. That's the part people never understand about a house like this. The cruelty is rarely loud, and it almost never comes first. It comes at dessert, dressed up as affection, with a glass raised and everyone watching. I knew it was coming. I could have left before it did. Instead, I told myself, the way I told myself every single year, one more year, and reached for the gravy boat. It came between the turkey and the pie, the way it always did. My Uncle Pat asked Claire some question about her hospital, and my father leaned back so the whole table could hear him, and he said it. Well, you know how it worked, out with my girls. One daughter's a doctor. He paused for the timing because my father has excellent timing. The other one's a waitress. 14 people laughed. Not crow, that's the thing. They laughed the warm, easy laugh of people who love a familiar bit. The way you laugh at an uncle who does the same card trick every Christmas. Aunt Sylvia put her hand on her chest. A cousin's teenager snorted into his soda. And my dad looked at me down the length of the table, pleased, the way a man looks at a joke he knows still works. I was standing at the sideboard with a stack of dirty salad plates in my hands, still wearing the apron. And I did the thing I have done at that table since I was 19. I smiled. I let it land because here is what none of them knew. I had heard that exact line, those exact words, in that exact order, at least a dozen Thanksgiving running, and every year it cost me a little more to keep my face still. My hands didn't shake. I want to be clear about that. I've carried trays through Saturday dinner rushes with 100 covers on the board. I don't drop things. I set the plates down softly, one at a time, and I thought about the apron, and I thought about my grandmother in the next room, and I did not yet know that this was the last year I would ever do this. To this day, I can picture the refrigerator I grew up under. My mother kept it like a trophy case. Claire's report cards went on the door at eye level, held with magnets shaped like little apples. And when she made the honor roll, the certificate went in a frame in the hall. My grades were fine. That was always the word for them. Fine. And fine did not get a magnet. I learned early that in our house, achievement wasn't a thing you felt privately. It was a thing you posted. A thing that earned you a place on the door. Claire was 3 years older and good at the exact things my parents had decided counted. Tests, trophies, the straight, clean line from high school to college to medical school that my father could. Describe to a stranger in one breath. I was good at things that didn't fit on a refrigerator. I could talk to anyone. I could keep 6 tables happy at once, and remember that table 4's little boy was allergic to walnuts. I could read a room in about 4 seconds flat, which is a skill nobody frames. And when the house got loud, when the comparison started and I could feel myself shrinking against the counter, there was exactly one place I could go where the scoreboard didn't reach. Down the hall, past the framed certificate, into a warm kitchen that smelled like butter and thyme, where my grandmother was always standing at the stove. She never asked me about grades. She handed me a wooden spoon and made room at the counter. And that was the first place in my life where I was simply uncomplicatedly enough. I didn't understand yet what she was teaching me. I only knew I could breathe in there. I was maybe 12 the first time she said it to me. I'd come into her kitchen after a parent-teacher, night that had gone the way they always went, with Claire's name said like a prayer and mine said like an apology. My grandmother, Nora, though I only ever called her grandma, was rolling out dough, and she looked at me over the top of her glasses and read the whole thing off my face without my saying a word. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Come here, sweetheart," she said. "Let me tell you something, and I want you to keep it." I came. "A job is what you do," she said. "It is not who you are." I didn't get it then. I was 12. I thought she was being nice. It took me 20 years to understand she was handing me a weapon. That kitchen is gone now, sold with the old house, and Grandma lives in the small in-law suite my parents built off their own kitchen. Close enough that you can hear her humming through the wall on a good day. She is 84. 14 months ago, a doctor who was not my sister said the word we'd all been circling, dementia. And now there are good days. And there are days she calls me by my mother's name. On the good days, she is completely, ferociously herself. And that was the whole reason I was standing in that apron at all, because the good days were getting rarer, and I had made myself a private, stupid, tender promise that while she was still here to see it, this family would stay in one piece around her. I didn't yet know that keeping that promise and keeping myself were about to become two different things. Here's the part my family has never bothered to learn. I am good at what I do. I don't clear tables at a chain by the highway. I run the floor at a farm-totable place downtown that books out 3 weeks ahead. And on a Saturday night, I am effectively the air traffic controller for a room of 90 people and a kitchen of 11. I know wine. I know how to tell a table their entree is going to be 20 minutes late in a way that makes them feel taken care of instead of forgotten. I trained half the servers there. And when the owner talks about opening a second room, my name is the first one. He says, "I built that. Nobody handed it to me off a refrigerator door. I make a good living. I own my car outright, and I sleep fine at night, which is more than my father, who measured his whole life in job titles, has ever managed." So when he calls me the waitress, like it's the punchline of my existence, the strange thing is that it doesn't really wound my pride anymore. I stopped needing them to be impressed a long time ago. I built a life at a safe distance, and I kept it there on purpose. That's what nobody who says, "Why did you keep going back?" ever understands. I didn't go back for them. I didn't go back to finally win. I went back for one person who was sitting behind that wall humming a song from 1962 running out of good days. Everything I let them do to me at that table, I let them do because leaving the table meant leaving her, and they knew it. On some level, I think my father always knew exactly which door I couldn't walk out of. My mother raised the first glass right after the joke, before the laugh had even finished. She does it like a woman who has practiced. She stood, tapped her fork against her wine glass twice, and the table quieted the way it never quieted for anything I said. I just want to say, she began already a little misty. How proud we are of Claire. Here it came, the residency, the fellowship, the patient who'd written the letter. My mother has the whole resume memorized, and she recites it every year like scripture. And every year the table murmurs and nods and lifts their glasses toward my sister. "To Claire," my mother said. "To Claire," they answered. And I watched my sister across that table do something I'd never let myself really see before. She smiled. She said, "Thank you." And her hand, reaching for her own glass to accept the toast, was not steady. It was the smallest thing, a tremor there and gone. The kind you'd miss if you hadn't spent 15 years, learning to read a room in 4 seconds. And I noticed something else. Claire lifted the glass and touched it to her lips and set it back down without drinking. There was water in front of her, and she drank that instead. I filed it away without knowing why. My whole life, I had looked at my sister and seen the person on the refrigerator door, the finished portrait, the one who got the toast. I had never once looked at her and seen a person who might be holding herself together with both hands under a table while everyone applauded. That night, for the first time, I did, and it changed the shape of everything that came after. I went back into the kitchen to plate the pie, and while I did it, I let myself count. Just once, all the things in that room that were mine. The turkey was mine. Brined, roasted, rested, carved. The stuffing was Grandma's recipe, cooked by my hands because my mother's version comes from a box and everyone knows it and nobody says it. The gravy was mine, the green beans, the rolls, the cranberry that wasn't from a can. I had shopped for it, paid for half of it, and started before dawn. And I was also, though it took saying it plainly in my own head to feel the weight of it, the person who scheduled Grandma's home aides, who kept the little laminated card of her medications in my purse, who drove her to the neurologist because my mother couldn't take the afternoon, and my father isn't good with that stuff. I did all of it quietly, the way you wipe down a table between courses, and I had told myself for years that this was love, that being the one who holds everything is the same as being the one everyone loves. Standing at that counter with a pie server in my hand, I heard the laughter roll out of the dining room again, someone reprising the joke for a cousin who'd missed it, and a thought I'd never allowed surfaced anyway. If I was so useful, why did being useful feel exactly like being invisible? I didn't have an answer. I carried the pie out with a smile because that is the muscle. You build in 20 years of service, the one that lets your face do one thing while everything underneath does another. But the question had gotten loose in me now, and I couldn't put it back. I brought a plate of pie back to Grandma's suite because she tires in crowds now, and we'd settled her in her chair by the window before the meal. It was a good day. I could tell the second I came through the door by the way her eyes found mine and actually landed sharp and present. My grandmother all, the way at the surface. "There's my girl," she said. "Not my mother's name, mine." I sat on the ottoman by her feet and handed her the pie, and she ate 3 bites and then set the fork down and looked at me for a long moment. "You cooked all of it again," she said. "It wasn't a question. Somebody's got to," I said and smiled. And she didn't smile back. She reached out and took my chin in her hand the way she had when I was 12. "Thea," she said, "are you happy in there, or are you just useful?" And I felt the whole evening go quiet inside me because in 84 years my grandmother has never once wasted a question. I opened my mouth to give her the answer. I gave everyone. "I'm fine, Grandma. I'm good." And she watched me not be able to say it. "You don't have to answer tonight," she said gently and patted my hand and looked back out the window. But I knew she'd remember she'd asked. On the good days, she remembers everything. And I sat there on the ottoman knowing I had just been handed a question I was going to have to answer with my life. You'd think the joke would run out of road. It doesn't. Later, over coffee, a set of cousins arrived who'd been at the earlier seating across town, and my father got to do the whole thing fresh for a new audience. And there is nothing my father loves like a new audience. "Thea is our people person," he told them, which sounds like a compliment until you hear where he lands it. "Claire fixes hearts, and Thea," he tipped his mug toward me. "Thea remembers how you take your coffee." Warm laughter again. And then the part that actually got under my skin because it was so small and so automatic. One of the new cousins, a woman about my age with a toddler on her hip, turned to me without a flicker of anything unkind in her face and said, "Oh, could I get a refill while you're up? Just a splash of cream?" While you're up? As if standing were my natural state in that house. As if the apron told everyone what I was for. And the worst part, The part I sat with for a long time afterward is that I said, "Of course," and got the cream. Because that was the reflex 2 decades of that table had built in me. Deeper than pride, deeper than anger, the reflex to smooth it over, to be easy, to carry the tray. I brought her the cream. I refilled 3 other cups while I was at it, because once you're up, you might as well. And somewhere under the smile, very quietly, something that had been asleep in me for a long time opened one eye. I didn't act on it, not yet. But I felt it turn over, and I knew it wasn't going back to sleep. I did the thing you're not supposed to do. I tried to explain myself. I don't even fully know why. Maybe Grandma's question had loosened something. But when the table thinned out and it was just my parents and Claire and me around the coffee, I heard myself say it. The owner's opening a second location in the spring. I said he wants me to run it. Salary, a piece of the profit. My name, on the paperwork. I said it plainly. No bragging, just a fact. The way Claire might mention a conference. For 1 second, I watched it reach my father, and I saw him almost meet me there, and then he did what he has done my whole life. He reached past it. "That's nice, honey," he said in the tone you use for a child's drawing. "Hey, Claire, did you tell them about the thing with the chief of medicine?" And just like that, the light swung back to my sister, and the second location, the thing I had built with my own 2 hands, sank without a ripple. Here's what I understood in that moment, and it landed harder than the joke ever had. Explaining myself would never work. It couldn't, because the problem was never that they didn't have the information. I could have laid every achievement I owned on that table, and it would have changed nothing, because they weren't failing to see my worth. They were measuring it on a scale where my whole life only ever counted as a rounding. Error next to the word doctor. You cannot win a game by playing it better when the game itself is rigged to erase you. I had spent 20 years trying to earn a seat by being impressive. I finally saw that the seat was never on offer. If you've ever been the one who quietly keeps a whole family running, the one nobody thanks because they assume you'll always be there, you already know how this feels. Stay with me. It gets sharper before it gets clear. And if this is your story, too, tell me in the comments, because what I overheard next changed the stakes entirely. I'd gone down the hall toward Grandma's suite to check on her, and I stopped outside the half-open kitchen door because I heard my own name. And then I heard the word facility. My parents were talking low. The way you talk when you've already decided something and you're just tidying up the logistics. After the holidays, my mother was saying it's just gotten to be too much. My father, Thea, can help her pack up. She's got the time. She's got the time. They were going to move my grandmother, the one person in that house who had ever truly seen me, out of the suite we'd built for her into a place. And they had decided it between themselves over coffee and slotted me in as the labor that would carry it out. Nobody had asked Grandma. Nobody had asked me. I stood in that hallway with my hand flat against the wall, and I felt the floor of the whole evening tilt. It wasn't that they wanted help. Everybody needs help sometimes. God knows caregiving is heavier than anyone admits. It was the casualness of it, the way my future had been assigned to me in a subordinate clause. She's got the time. I did not go into that kitchen and start a fight. I went to Grandma's door and I sat with her while she slept, and I let the thing in my chest get very cold and very clear. I found my mother alone at the sink an hour later, and I asked her quietly about what I'd heard. I kept my voice level. I've diffused angrier tables than that. Kitchen. Were you going to tell me you're moving Grandma? She didn't even have the grace to look startled. Oh, we were going to talk to you about it. You're so good with all that, Thea. You have the time. And honestly, you're better at it than any of us. And there it was, laid out plain. The thing I'd spent 20 years refusing to see. I had always told myself they leaned on me because they trusted me, because I was capable, because being the reliable one meant being valued. Standing at that sink, watching my mother rinse a wine glass and hand me the family's hardest job like she was handing me a dish towel, I finally understood the truth of it. They didn't lean on me because they respected me. They leaned on me because they didn't. In their arithmetic, my time was worth less. So my time was the time you spent. A doctor's hours were precious. A waitress's hours were just available. The caregiving hadn't been given to me as an honor. It had been assigned to me as a station, the same way the apron was, the same way the folding table was. My usefulness wasn't the opposite of their contempt. It was the shape their contempt took. "You're right," I said to my mother, and she smiled, relieved, thinking I'd agreed to handle it. I hadn't. I just finally heard out loud the exact size of the box they'd been keeping me in. And a box you can see the walls of is a box you can decide to leave. Grandma woke around 8, cleared, and asked me to bring her the box. I knew the one. It's a battered tin recipe box, painted with faded roses that has lived in her kitchen my whole life and now lives on her dresser. I brought it and sat on the ottoman, and she held it in her lap with both hands like it weighed more than it did. "I've been meaning to give you this," she said, "while I still know, too." She opened it. Inside were the cards, decades of them. Her handwriting getting shakier the closer you got to the front. The stuffing, the pie crust, the brine, all the things I'd cooked that day and every year in her. Hand, some of them stained from her mother's kitchen before her. "These are yours," she said. "Not Claire's. Yours. You're the only one who ever wanted to stand at the stove with me." I told her I couldn't take them, that they belonged in the family. And she gripped my wrist with more strength than an 84-year-old should have and looked at me until I stopped talking. "Listen to me, because I might not have this clear tomorrow," she said. "Your father measures everybody with a ruler his own father beat him with. He can't help it, and he won't stop it. But you," she tapped the box, "you I raised in the kitchen on purpose so you'd have one room in your life where nobody was keeping score." Her eyes were wet and completely lucid. "Promise me something. Don't let them make you the help in your own family. You hear me? You are not the help. You never were," I promised. I didn't fully know yet what I was promising. I was still standing. I realized I'd been in that house for 13 hours, and I had not once sat down at the table. I was standing even now with her box in my hands and my apron still on. And something about holding that tin, her whole life of unscored love packed into it, made the apron strings feel for the first time like something tied around my throat. Claire had worked the early shift and come straight from the hospital, still half in it the way ER doctors are, that thousandy calm they wear home. She'd missed the meal and arrived for the coffee, and my father lit up like a marquee. "There she is," he announced too. The room. Straight from Saving Lives. He made her tell a story. She had one ready. They always have one ready. The doctors, a clean anecdote sized for a dinner table. And she told it well. The difficult case, the good outcome, and the relatives leaned in and glowed at her. And my father sat back in the particular contentment of a man watching his best investment appreciate. And I watched my sister perform being my sister because that's what it was. I could see it now that I was looking. Every beat of that story was calibrated to give the table what it wanted. And underneath the calibration, she looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with a long shift. When my father said saving lives, she flinched just at the eyes, just for an instant. The same tremor I'd seen at the toast. She caught me looking. For 1 second, across that crowded room, my sister and I looked straight at each other with no scoreboard between us. And I saw something in her face I had never once let myself imagine was there. It wasn't smugness. It wasn't the serene superiority of the girl on the refrigerator door. It was something closer to drowning. Then someone asked her another question, and the performance closed back over her face like water, and she was Dr. Claire O'Neill again, pride of the family, and I was the waitress refilling the coffee, but I had seen it, and I couldn't unsee it. I caught her alone in the kitchen a few minutes later, both of us on the same errand of escape, and for a moment, neither of us reached for the script. She was leaning against the counter with her eyes closed. "You look wrecked," I said, not unkind. She laughed, short and humorless. "I'm always wrecked, Thea. That's the job." And then, Because the kitchen was warm and Grandma's kitchen had always been the one room where the truth was allowed, she said more than she meant to. I haven't slept through the night in 2 years. David and I are. She stopped. David moved out in September. I hadn't known. Nobody had. Told me because in the family broadcast, Claire's life is only ever the highlight reel. I'm thinking about leaving medicine, she said so quietly. I almost missed it. And I can't tell anyone because do you have any idea what happens in this family if I stop being the doctor? I'm not a person to them, Thea. I'm a title. The day I hand back the title, I'm as invisible as. And she caught herself and looked at me, and the end of the sentence sat between us. As invisible as you. She didn't say it. She didn't have to. We stood there, the doctor and the waitress, and for the length of one breath, we understood each other completely. That the same ruler that had erased me by calling me too little had erased her by calling her everything. Then my mother's voice floated in from the dining room. Claire, sweetheart, come tell the Hendersons about the fellowship. And I watched my sister square her shoulders and fix her face and go. She went back to being the trophy. But something between us had shifted, and we both knew it. I want to tell you about the exact moment a belief you've built your life on falls over, because it isn't loud. Mine fell over while I was drying a serving platter. For 33 years, I had operated on a single organizing faith, that if I made myself indispensable, if I was the one who cooked, who drove, who scheduled, who carried, who never asked for anything and never dropped a plate, then one day the ledger would balance, and I would finally be worth as much to this family as my sister's diploma. That was the deal I'd made alone when I was 12 and shrinking against a counter. Be so useful they can't imagine life without you, and usefulness will turn into love. I dried that platter, and I finally saw the whole shape of the lie. It was never going to turn into love. It couldn't because I'd built the entire thing on the same scale they used. I'd just been keeping my own private column, the caregiving column, the who does more column, and telling myself that if I won it, I'd win them. But you cannot beat a scoreboard by scoring on it. Every casserole, every neurologist appointment, every dawn drive was another point. I logged in a game that was designed so my points would never count. I had spent 2 decades trying to earn my way off a refrigerator door I was never on. And the cruelest part was that I'd done it to myself as much as they'd done it to me. Grandma's question came back and stood in the middle of the kitchen. Are you happy or are you just useful? I set the platter down. I understood at last that those were not 2 ways of describing the same life. They were opposites, and I had chosen the wrong one. Every single year on purpose, there was a shoebox in the hall closet I'd been sent to find a phone charger in, and it spilled. And that's how I ended up on the floor holding a piece of my father I'd never been meant to see. It was a small ledger, cheap and old. My grandfather's handwriting on the cover. My father's father dead before I was born. I opened it. It wasn't accounts. It was my father. Every line was a date and a number and a verdict. Raymond, age 9, paper route, $410. Could do better. Raymond, 15, summer at the plant, $92, lazy at it. Raymond, 22, foreman, still nothing to show. Page after page of a boy being weighed and found light in his own father's hand in ink. And I sat on that closet floor, and I understood my father in a way that did not excuse him, but did for a moment unclench my fist. He hadn't invented the ruler he beat us with. He'd inherited it. He'd been measured his whole boyhood by a man who could only see a paycheck, and he'd clawed his way up, chasing a passing grade he never got. And somewhere along the way, the ruler became the only instrument he owned for feeling anything about the people he loved. He looked at Claire and saw a number that finally would have made his own father nod. He looked at me and saw the low column he'd been terrified of his whole life. It was almost unbearably sad. And here's the thing I made myself hold on to sitting there. Understanding where the ruler came from did not mean I had to keep letting him lay it across my back or Claire's or my grandmother's. You can grieve for the man and still take the ruler out of his hands. I closed the box. I put it back and I stood up. Then the evening reminded me how little time I actually had. There was a crash from Grandma's suite. I got there first. I'm always the one who gets there first. And found her on the floor beside her chair, not hurt, but frightened in a way that broke something in me because she didn't know where she was. The good day had ended between 1 minute and the next the way it does now. She looked up at me and her eyes were wide and lost. "Where's Nora's kitchen?" she asked me. "I have to get back to the kitchen." She thought she was somewhere else, some decade else. I got down on the floor with her and held her hands and talked. Her back slow, the way you talk a frightened table down from a ruined night. And after a while, she came partway back and let me help her into her chair. My mother appeared in the doorway, took in the scene, and said, "See, this is exactly what I mean. It's too much," and went to get my father. I knelt there holding my grandmother's hands, and I felt the clock in my chest strike a number I'd been refusing to read. She was going, "Not tonight, not this month." But the good days were, burning down like a candle you can watch. And every single one of them that I spent standing in an apron being the family punchline was a day I would never, ever get back. In the dining room, I could hear my mother reaching for her glass again. Before I left her suite, in that fragile, half-lit place between lost and found where she lives now, my grandmother said it again. She was settled in her chair, calmer, my hand in both of hers, and she wasn't fully back, but she wasn't fully gone either. She looked at me, and something in her recognized something in me, older than names. "A job is what you do," she said. To the window, to me, to the room, to 1962. It's not who you are. The same words she'd handed me at 12 over a sheet of rolled dough. And this time they didn't land like comfort. They landed like a verdict on the last 2 decades of my life, because I had spent those decades doing the exact opposite of what she'd told me. I had let a job, first the apron, then the whole invisible second. Job of holding this family up, become the entire answer to the question of who I was. I had let them define me by what I did. And worse, I had helped by making myself into nothing but a function, a set of hands, a woman who was always up anyway. My grandmother, who could no longer reliably find the year, had held on to that one sentence through the fog because she'd known, maybe better than I did, that I would need it. I sat with her until she drifted toward sleep. I could feel the whole shape of my life pressing on me. The apron, the box on the dresser, the crash, the toast I could hear building in the other room, the promise I'd made an hour ago and hadn't kept for a single second since. Something had to give. I already knew walking back down that hall that it was going to be me. Here is the thing I had to see before I could do anything. And it's the hardest thing I've ever admitted. The scoreboard wasn't only theirs. It was mine, too. I'd spent the whole night furious at my father for measuring people. And somewhere between the sink and the closet and my grandmother's shaking hands, I caught myself doing my own version of exactly the same arithmetic. I'd been keeping score my entire life, who cooked the meal, who drove to the appointments, who paid for half the groceries, who showed up at dawn while the others slept. I'd built a private ledger every bit as detailed as my grandfather's, and in it, I was winning. I was the good one, the one who really loved this family. And I'd been waiting for years without ever saying it, for someone to open my ledger and read it out loud and finally declare me the winner. That was the trap. And I'd walked into it as surely as my father had, because the moment you're keeping score, you've already agreed to be measured. You've already accepted that your worth is a number that someone else has to tally and approve. My grandmother had tried to hand me the one thing that lived outside all of it. A kitchen with no scoreboard, a love with no ledger. And I'd taken her recipes and used them to cook a meal I served as proof of my own goodness. I didn't want to win anymore. That was the change. Standing in the hallway with the toast rising in the next room, I felt the wanting to win drain out of me and something quieter and much stronger take its place. I didn't want to beat them at the game. I wanted to stop playing it, and I finally understood there was only one way to do that. I know some of you are waiting for me to make a scene to win, but that's not what this is. What happened next cost me more than any comeback ever could. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, hit subscribe. You'll want to see how it lands. Because when I came back into the dining room, my family was setting up the annual ritual, the one that always closes the night, the toast round. It's exactly what it sounds like. My father taps his glass, and one by one we go around and everyone says a little something. And it is without fail a lap around the track of everyone's achievements with 2 guaranteed stops. A long, warm one at Claire and a short comic one at me, where I'm expected to deliver some cheerful, self-deprecating line about my year so the table can laugh and feel that the natural order is intact. I have written that line in my head every Thanksgiving for a decade. This year, I'd even half prepared one in the car on the way over out of pure reflex. A little joke about the second. Location. Something that would let my father land his ruler softly and let everyone go home comfortable. My father tapped his glass now, the table settled. My mother beamed, and I stood at the edge of it, still up, of course, still in the apron, still not seated, with the prepared line sitting in my mouth like a coin. I could feel exactly how the next 10 minutes were supposed to go. I could feel the groove of it, worn smooth by 20 years, pulling me toward the easy thing, the peacekeeping thing, the thing that would protect the fragile hole for Grandma's sake. And behind me, down the hall, my grandmother was asleep, running out of days. I almost did it. I need you to understand how close I came, because anyone who's ever sat at a table like this knows that the pull toward peace is not weakness. It's love bent into the wrong shape. My father went first, as he always does, and toasted the year and slid smoothly into Claire, and the resume came out, and the table warmed, and I watched my sister accept it with that steady smile and those unsteady hands, and every cell in my body that had been trained since childhood leaned toward the groove. "Just do the bit," the old voice said. "Just do the little joke. Take the laugh. Keep the night whole. Grandma wants the family in one piece. You promised her the family in one piece. If you blow this up, you lose the table. And if you lose the table, you lose your seat by her chair. And she has so little time." It was a good argument. It was the argument I'd used to keep, myself in that apron for 20 years. And the terrible thing about it was that it was built out of real love. I did want the family whole for her. I would have given almost anything for one clean, warm Thanksgiving before the fog took her all the way. And that was exactly the trap my father's whole world ran on. That the people who love the most will swallow the most, will carry the most, will absorb any humiliation to keep the thing from breaking. My want and my need stood on opposite sides of that table and looked at each other. To keep the family Grandma loved, I had to keep being erased. To stop being erased, I might have to break the family in her last good season. There was no version where I got both. My mother reached for her glass. She stood, my mother, and tapped her glass a second time that night, and I knew before she opened her mouth exactly what was coming, because it comes every year, and it had already come once. And I have to say it again, she said, glowing, lifting her wine toward my sister, Claire. "We are so, so proud of you, our daughter, the doctor." And the table lifted their glasses a second time to Claire, and someone started to clap. And then they were all clapping warm and easy, applauding my sister for the second time in one night for the crime of having the right title. And I watched 2 things happen at once, and they broke me open. I watched my sister's face. The smile stayed nailed on, but her eyes over the rim of the glass, she once again touched to her lips, and once again did not drink from, filled with something that was not pride and was not joy. It was the look of a person being buried under praise, applauded straight into a grave, drowning in exactly the water everyone thinks she's swimming in. And I watched my father beaming, entirely certain he was in a happy home. Both of his daughters were in that room, and neither of us was actually there. One of us had been erased by too little and one by too much, and the same hand had done both. And it was clapping now. That was the moment, not the joke, not the refill, not even the plan to move Grandma. It was the sight of my brilliant, exhausted, drowning sister accepting her second toast with dead eyes, while a room full of people who loved her congratulated her on disappearing. I sat down the coffee pot I was holding, and I reached back and untied the apron. I want to describe this precisely because it was the smallest gesture, and it ended one version of my life. I reached behind my back, and I untied the apron strings, and I lifted the loop over. My head and I folded it once, in half the way you fold a cloth napkin at the end of a shift. The clapping was still going. Nobody was watching me yet. I was scenery. I walked the length of the table to the head of it where my father sat, and I set the folded apron down on the tablecloth beside his plate gently. No drama the way you'd set down a check. And then I did the thing I had not done one single time in 13 hours in that house. I pulled out the empty chair at the foot of the table, the seat nobody sits in because the food never sits down, and I sat in it. I sat down at my own family's table as a guest for the first time in my adult life. The clapping faltered. You could feel the room's attention swing, the way a restaurant floor goes quiet when a glass breaks somewhere you can't see. My mother's toast hung half-finished in the air. My father looked at the apron folded next to his plate and then at me sitting where I had never once sat, and his face did something complicated because he could feel a rule being broken but couldn't yet name which one. "Thea," my mother said. "Honey, we're not done." "Could you get the sit down, Mom?" I said quietly. Not sharp, just done. She sat more out of shock than obedience, and into that first pure silence, my father, trying to reclaim the room, reached for the oldest tool he had. He smiled and opened his mouth to make the joke. "Well," my father said, spreading his hands to the table, going for the laugh that had never once failed him. "Looks like the waitress is finally taking a break." "I'm not the waitress, Dad. I didn't raise my voice. That's the part I'm proudest of. Looking back, I never raised my voice, not once, the whole way through. I just said it plainly into the quiet, and the plainness of it landed harder than shouting ever could have. "I'm not the waitress. I'm not the help. I'm your daughter, and I'm done keeping score." He blinked. "Nobody's keeping score, sweetheart. It's a joke. You've made that same joke at this table for 12 years, I said. One's a doctor, one's a waitress. I've counted. I let that sit. And tonight, I finally figured out why it works. It works because everyone at this table has agreed that a person is worth exactly what's printed on their business card. That's the whole joke. That's the only reason it's funny. The room was dead silent now. Even the kids had stopped. My father's smile was still on his face, but it had gone, rigid, a smile with no engine behind it. "I'm not doing it anymore," I said. "I'm not doing the bit. I'm not being the one who's always up, always carrying, always available, because my time is the cheap time. I'm not going to stand in an apron and cook the meal and schedule the aides and drive to the neurologist and then sit still while you introduce me to strangers as the punchline." My voice never rose, but something underneath it had gone to iron. I did all of that for years, and I told myself it was love. It wasn't love. It was a job you assigned me so none of you would ever have to actually look at me. Well, I quit that job. Effective now. My mother's hand was at her throat. My father had gone a color I'd never seen on him. And somewhere to my left, very softly, I heard my sister set down her glass. My father found his footing the way men like him always do. He went on the attack. Because to a man with a ruler, being questioned feels exactly like being struck. "You know what your problem is?" he said, and his voice was, climbing now, the composure cracking. And I understood in real time that I was watching the whole thing invert. "Your problem is you've always been jealous of your sister. You couldn't hack what she did, so you went and poured drinks, and now you want to stand here and lecture this family." "Dad." Claire's voice. Quiet, but it cut through him because Claire never interrupts him. Claire is the trophy, and trophies don't talk back. He stopped, startled. But I answered him first, and I kept my voice. Level because I could see that my calm was the one thing in the room he had no tool for. "I'm not jealous of Claire," I said. "I love Claire. And if you'd ever once looked at her instead of her title, you'd see she's not okay and hasn't been for years. And the reason she can't tell you is that the second she stops being your doctor, she's afraid you'll look at her the way you look at me." Claire made a small sound. My father's mouth opened and nothing came out. "That's what the scoreboard does," I said, still quiet, still level to the whole table now. "It doesn't just crush the one on the bottom, it hollows out the one on top. You've spent 30 years so proud of one daughter and so amused by the other that you never noticed you were losing both of us the exact same way. I wasn't doing it to win. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I felt no triumph. There was no part of me enjoying my father's face. I was simply finally telling the truth in the one room where the truth had been forbidden my entire life. And the cost of it was arriving in real time, and I paid it with my eyes open. Then it broke the way these things break all at once and in several directions. Aunt Sylvie stood up, scandalized, and announced that this was no way to speak to your father on Thanksgiving, and gathered her coat and her husband, and the leaving started. Chairs scraping, that awful murmur of relatives finding urgent reasons to be in their cars. My mother was crying now, the appearance. She'd spent 40 years building collapsing in front of everyone. How could you? In front of the family. How could you do this to us? And I realized she wasn't grieving anything I'd said. She was grieving the smooth surface of the evening, the photograph of a happy family that she needed more than she needed either of her actual children. My father had stopped speaking entirely and was staring at the folded apron by his plate like it was an accusation, which I suppose it was, and I felt the cost. Land, full weight, exactly as I'd known it would. This was the family Grandma loved, splintering in her last good season, and I was the one who'd struck the match. I would very likely lose my easy access to her now. My parents controlled that suite, that door, and I had just made an enemy of the man who held the key. I might have traded my grandmother's final months for one night of finally telling the truth. I knew it, sitting there. I had counted the cost before I ever untied the apron, and I'd chosen anyway. And choosing anyway is the only kind of courage I've ever actually believed in. The room was emptying around me. My win, if you could even call it that, was arriving in the same breath as everything it cost. And then I turned to the one person still sitting at that wreck of a table, my sister, who had put down her glass and hadn't moved, and I held out my hand across the ruins of the meal I'd cooked, and I said the only thing left to say, "Claire, set your glass down. Come with me." My sister looked at my hand. She looked at our father, who was even now even wrecked, still the center of gravity in her whole life, the sun she'd been orbiting since before I was born. Everything she was, the title, the toasts, the framed certificate, the safe, warm approval of a room that had never once made her prove she was more than her job. All of it lived on that side of the table, and all I was offering her was my open hand and a walk out into the cold with nothing printed on it. It was a bigger leap for her than it had ever been for me. I'd been standing at the edge of that door my whole life. She'd been enthroned in the middle of the room, and I watched my sister, Dr. Claire O'Neill, the pride of the family, do the bravest thing I have ever seen a person do. She pushed back her chair. She set her glass in the middle of the table deliberately, the way you lay down a hand of cards. You're finished playing. And she stood up and she took my hand. "Okay," she said just. That. "Okay." My father said her name, Claire, and there was something in it I'd never heard from him before. Something close to fear, because his best investment was walking away from the portfolio. And for the first time in his life, the ruler wasn't working. She didn't answer him. She held my hand, and the two of us walked the length of that dining room together, past the wreckage of the meal, past the folded apron, past our weeping mother and our silent father, and the last few relatives, pretending not to watch, and we went out through the kitchen, and I opened the door, and the November cold came in clean and sharp and honest. We stepped out into it together. 2 daughters, no scoreboard, nothing printed on either of us, but our own names. The door closed behind us, and for the first time in my entire life, I had walked out of that house without leaving the one person I loved behind because she was walking out beside me. We didn't leave, though. Not yet, because there was one door I would never walk out of without stopping, and Claire knew it, too. We went back in through the side entrance to Grandma's suite, quiet as thieves in our own family, to say good night to her before we drove off into whatever came next. She was awake, and by some grace I will be grateful for as long as I live. She was there, all the way there, clear-eyed, present, my grandmother at the very surface of herself in the lamplight. She looked at the two of us standing in her doorway, holding hands, coats on, faces, still raw from the wreck down the hall. And she didn't need anyone to explain it. She understood. She'd probably understood before either of us did. "There they are," she said softly. "My girls." And then she looked right at me, and she said the thing that closed a circle 20 years around. "I always knew who you were, Thea, long before any of them clapped for anything." Her eyes moved to Claire and gentled. "Both of you, a job is what you do." She patted the arm of her chair. "It was never who you are." I knelt by her chair, and I put my head in her lap like I was 12 years old in a kitchen that no longer exists. And she stroked my hair, and I understood the full and terrible arithmetic of the night. In that one moment, I had been seen finally, completely by the one person whose seeing had ever mattered, and I had bought it at the price of the whole fragile family she'd wanted, kept in one piece, in a season where every day was numbered. I had won, and I had lost, in the same breath, in the same lamp room, and I would not have traded a second of it. It's been a while now, and I can tell you how it settled, because the truth is quieter than the blow-up and a lot more durable. I didn't lose my grandmother. That was the fear that had kept me in the apron for 20 years. And it turned out to be smaller than it looked in the dark. My father was furious for exactly as long as it took him to realize that I was the one who actually knew how her care worked. The aides, the medications, the neurologist, and that his threats over that door were empty because he needed me on the other side of it. So we made an arrangement, cold and practical. And I see her more now, not less, because I come as her granddaughter instead of the family's unpaid staff. We hired a second aide. Claire pays for half. She can afford it, and for the first time, she wanted to. My sister cut back her hours in the spring. She's in therapy. She and David are talking slowly. She calls me on Sunday nights, and we don't compare anything. We just talk. Two people, instead of two titles, and it's the realest thing either of us has. The family is smaller now. Some of the relatives took my father's side, and some quietly told me in texts they'd never say out loud at a table that they had always wondered why I put up with it. Thanksgiving this year was 6 people in my apartment instead of 14 in that dining room. I cooked because I love to cook Grandma's recipes out of the tin box with the faded roses that sits on my counter now. But this year, I cooked because I wanted to. And when the meal was ready, I took off my apron and I sat down and I ate. I won't tell you my father changed because he didn't. Not really. That's not how it works. And I'd be lying if I dressed it up for you. He still measures people with the only ruler he was ever given. He still talks about Claire's title to anyone who will hold still, though he does it now to a smaller and smaller audience, and never to her face because she doesn't come when he calls anymore. My mother waver. She calls me sometimes and we talk about Grandma. And once near the end of a call, she said, "I don't know how it all got so and couldn't finish." And I let the silence be kind and didn't finish it for her. The scoreboard is still up in that house. I didn't tear it down. You can't tear down a thing that lives inside someone else. But I stopped standing under it. And so did Claire. And here's the part that matters most to me. My niece, Claire's girl, 7 years old, was in my kitchen last week, and I heard her tell her mother, apropos of nothing, "Aunt Thea makes the best food in the whole family." And Claire said, "She does. Nobody kept score. Nobody had to. Here's the only thing I know for sure after all of it. A title tells you what someone does on a Tuesday, and it will never once tell you who they are when the lights go down and the clapping stops. That's my story. One apron folded and set down. one glass put back on the table, and a grandmother who saw me long, before anyone thought to clap for anything. If there is someone in your life you only ever introduce by their job, the nurse, the teacher, the one who's always up, always caring, always available, call them tonight and ask them who they actually are. Then share this video with the person you already thought of while I was talking. Thank you for being here, truly. Drop a comment. Tell me about the one who saw you.